Okay, Prof. Happy for you to go ahead and start and tell us a bit more about, what implications COVID-19 has had on the South African economy, and more importantly, what modeling can tell us about that.
Okay, thanks, Ayabong, and it's a great pleasure to be talking here, and welcome to all the students. I hope you get something out of this. Can we put up my presentation? I can't see it. Thank you. Next slide. So Sherwin and I are going to be talking to, can I go to the next slide? Sherwin and I are going to be talking to you about economy-wide modeling in a policy environment. We're going to illustrate this by drawing on some work we've done on modeling the impacts of COVID in South Africa. This draws on some papers that we've published or we've been joint authors on. But I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of modeling and the specific approach we took to modeling the COVID impact. And then Sherwin's going to take over and show you some of the results we got, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion after that. Next, please. You've gone too far. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so as people know, economists use models. One could say it's their central tool to simplify reality so that they can understand reality. And there's a lot of discussion about what are appropriate models and how do you test whether they're appropriate. There are a wide range of models available. It's not the case that we have one model fits all, one size fits all. Wide range of models available to economists, and these models are used in the policy environment. Most people think about modeling as in a budget office or treasury as being related to forecasting, and forecasting's definitely one of the more important things that treasury modelers have to do. But there are also other models that are used, and I'm going to talk about some of them. And they essentially used as laboratories for thinking about what the potential impact of a policy is. Before we introduce a policy, we would like to know, understand what its potential impacts are. So when we look at this in a policy environment, we need models of the whole economy, not simply a part of it. We may have a specific policy that aims at a specific sector, but that has repercussions for the whole economy. And policy makers are interested in what the impact on the whole economy is. So we need models that take into account the whole economy. Next, please. Well, obviously, macroeconomic models, anyone who studied economics knows that macroeconomic models are economy-wide models. They cover the whole economy. But often macroeconomic models are too aggregated for the sorts of things that policymakers are interested in. So, for example, the macro model might tell us that GDP is going to rise, but the policymakers are interested in which sectors is it going to rise in, which ones will rise faster than others. There may be a policy is causing unemployment, or a shock like COVID is causing unemployment. Which types of labor are going to lose their jobs most, and so on. So what we want are models that can take into account, can be more disaggregated. One could think of macro models that the pandemic, we know the pandemic's caused a decline in GDP. It's, some people call it the corona contraction. Other people think it's a policy-induced recession. And one might think that macro models, since they deal with recessions and business cycles, they would be the appropriate tool to look at the impact of COVID. But macro models tend to deal with top-down, what we can call top-down recessions. They often will start at some level, often in the financial sector, and they spread over time into the real economy. They take time to work their way through the economy. If one thinks of the Great Depression in the 1930s, or more recently, the Great Recession of 2008, 2010, they mostly started off in a particular sector or in the financial sector, and they took time to spread through to the real sector. The pandemic recession, the corona contraction, was not like that. The corona contraction started off by hitting certain sectors of the economy and hitting them very quickly. The real economy collapsed very quickly, and it then worked its way through to a much wider recession hitting the whole economy. And so we need an appropriate model for exploring bottom-up recessions. Next, please. Now, we have a range of models that can do this. I'd like to call them economy-wide models. And they are more disaggregated than the macroeconomic models we're used to. They've got many more sectors. They view the economy as a system, a whole system of interactions. In modern parlance, we'd call it a network. And the various parts of the economy interact with each other directly often, but also indirectly through knock-on effects and so on, as we will see later. So these sorts of models seem appropriate for bottom-up recessions. Next. Most of these models start off by constructing or are based on what we call a social accounting matrix. And the social accounting matrix, a SAM, is simply a way of showing the circular flow of income in a consistent and disaggregated way. And we'll see how disaggregated it can get. We divide the economy up into various accounts, where the different parts of the economy, production, consumption, and so on. We will construct accounts for them, and then we record over a given period all of the transactions that take place between these accounts. Now, let's just take a quick look at a stylized SAM, and I realize I should be doing this myself. Next slide. I can't point to what I'm talking about here because I'm not running the slideshow, but you can see this is a stylized SAM. We've got across the top accounts in sectors, factors of production, households, government, and so on. And the same accounts going down the rows. And within each cell, we show the transactions between these accounts. So in the first cell, we show intermediate inputs. These are what firms buy from each other as raw materials and manufactured products that they use in the production of their output. And when we go down, we see there's factors of production are used in production. Value added is created, wages, profits, and so on, rents are created there. And so going down that column, we're seeing all the things that firms are buying from the different accounts. When we go across the row, we see all of the incomes or received by the different accounts. So when we go across, we can see households are spending money buying from sectors. Government buys from sectors, inputs into government process. Investors buy real goods from sectors, and so on. And so we set up a matrix like this. Those of you familiar with national income accounting will know this is like a double entry bookkeeping, but except that we do it in a matrix where we can show it in a much more compact way, the flow of, around this, the circular flow. Next slide, please. So when we set up our data like this, the SAM is exhaustive. It covers the whole economy. So everything we can find data on and put in is in the economy. We see every transaction, and most importantly, it's consistent. Each account the incomings into each account have to equal the outflows, the outgoing. The use of income and the generation of income have to be equal. The SAM must balance, and this is a crucial thing for the modeling that we're going to do. The SAM disaggregation we have depends on the purpose we want to use it for and on data availability. Let's just take a look at the South African SAM. Next slide, please. For our modeling of COVID, we used a fairly standard macro SAM that's been used at different dates for work within the Treasury, and it's got 62 sectors in it. They produce 104 different products, goods, and services. They use capital, and we have 4 types of labor separated by or distinguished by their educational levels. We've got 14 different types of household identified by decile, except that the richest decile is divided into 5 2% groups. Because South Africa's income and consumption is so unequal, we need a lot more disaggregation at the top to capture things. And then we've got government and various taxes, savings and investment going in. And finally, trade, imports, exports, the whole current account balance. Now, this is the SAM that we've constructed. Some they're available on the web for people who want to look at them. For 2015, SAM has been used. We're now updating towards the 2019 SAM. Not all SAMs look alike. Different SAMs to different countries and for different purposes. You may decide to hide some detail because you're not interested in that particular aspect of the economy. But the important thing is it's a exhaustive, and it covers the whole economy, and it must balance. Okay, so next slide, please. As I've said, the SAM must balance. And one way to think of this sorts of models we build on top of SAMs is that the models are specifying the rules by which the SAM rebalances after there's been a disturbance. How does it get that if I have to pay more taxes as a household, and I pay those taxes, then obviously if my income hasn't risen, I've got to make some other adjustments. I've got to reduce my consumption or reduce my savings or get some transfers or borrow or whatever. When we're building a model based on the SAM, we write down those rules in a fairly precise way, and that reflects the way we think the economy works. There are 2 types of SAM-based models. Lots of varieties within them. Don't think it's, again, one model fits all. There are lots of different varieties and a big literature on this. But the 2 broad types in this family are multiplier models, which we're going to talk more about. And multiplier models, they assume that prices are fixed and that the economy operates proportionally. If a particular production process is spending 20% of its costs are on electricity, we assume that 20% is a fixed proportion, and so if it doubles its output, its use of electricity is going to go up. It's a very highly simplifying assumption, and there's discussion around it, and we've got some ways of varying them a little bit within SAM multipliers. But in the CGE model, a computable general equilibrium model, what we have flexible prices that when the demand for something rises, the price may go up, and then people adjust to it, and firms adjust to it. Whatever. If wages rise, not only do costs of production rise, but the incomes can rise, and people can make adjustments to those things. So the CGE models are more flexible. Both types, they add up. They're consistent with the national accounts, and this is an important thing. One way of thinking about this is we take a lot of information we get from microeconomics and microeconomic behavior, and we put it all together in a big model, and we impose on it a consistency that GDP has to add up. You can't, as you know, in undergraduate economics, you learn y equals c plus I plus g plus e minus x or something. That's a consistency check that the microeconomics has to add up in that way. So we're reflecting both micro and macro models, economics. If I can just say, some people talk about macro models having representative agents. All models have representative agents. We don't individually appear, not all the 60 million South Africans appear in each model we have, but they're all representative. We have a large number of representative models. You think we've got 14 representative households representing different strata in the income distribution and so on. Next slide, please. You could think about the SAM. You could trace through the SAM just looking at it, how you think a COVID shock would move through the economy. If we take something like government saying restaurants are non-essential and they must close down, so immediately the restaurants lay off workers and they reduce their profits. Value added falls in the restaurant sector, and GDP falls directly because of the restaurant sector being closed down. But there are knock-on effects from this, and as restaurants output falls, they also reduce their purchases of inputs. As they produce less, they no longer buy as much food or wine or whatever as inputs, and so that knocks on to the sectors that were supplying those things and producing those things. And those sectors, as they find their demands falling, they would also reduce their inputs. The various food producers start producing less food, and so you get a contraction going on because of the contraction of the one sector, the restaurant sector. At the same time, they reduced employment, reduces household incomes, and so their expenditures fall. And there's a further thing. So we've got two kind of circuits going around here, which is causing the economy to contract just from the one sector being closed down. Now, obviously, under the pandemic, lots of things were restricted, and not just because of the government mandate. People stopped going to work because and avoiding public transport and so on, and so they GDP contracted, and that's the multiplier. Next slide, please. Now, we're all familiar, or all economists are familiar with multipliers. It's a notion that's been around a long time. But generally, we think of macroeconomic multipliers. So injections, investment into the economy adds to demand. That causes expansion, but each time it goes round the circular flow, the expansion a bit leaks out into savings or taxation or whatever. And that same multiplier is operating in our models. The import content of the economy matters for the size of the multiplier. But in addition to the macro, because we've got this microstructure, the inter-industry linkages, the buying, some firms buying from other firms, creates this network which creates another circuit which adds to the multiplier and constrains the things. In CG model, if we were doing a CG model, we would find that prices rise to constrain these in even more ways. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So the question for us when we started modeling this back in April last year, what type of economy-wide model should we use? And our thinking was the lockdown effect is on quantities. It's not because prices have risen that people aren't buying stuff. It's because they can't get it. They're not allowed to produce it. So it's not the price mechanism causing this thing to spread through the economy. The government mandated a fall in output, essentially. It's an induced recession in that sense, if you want to think it that way. And households might have changed their patterns of consumption, but it wasn't because relative prices changed. This has got too expensive, so I'm going to buy less of it. It was simply they couldn't get it. And in fact, we found under the pandemic, some of the wealthier households, their savings went up, and around the world, you find a lot of private savings went up because they couldn't spend what they had. So we decided also that in the short run, when the COVID impacted, technology couldn't change. Firms were left with what the period we're looking at is too short for them to change their production side. So we decided it's appropriate to use the multiplier approach. Some other modelers around the world use CG models, and you can get them. But when they used them, what they did was to shut down all of the response functions and essentially make it as close to a multiplier model as they could get. We just used a multiplier model. So for long-term recovery, we would want to use a CG model, and that's what we're starting to do. So let me hand over to Sherwin then.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. I'm just going to load up my screen over here and get my presentation rolling. All right. I hope that's visible.
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for the confirmation, everyone. Yes, so good morning to everyone tuning into today's discussion. My name is Sherwin Gabriel. I'm a researcher at the International Food Policy Research Institute, focusing on economic simulation modeling. As Rob's mentioned, over the past 18 months, there's been a range of research on the impact of COVID-19 on various economies using multiplier models, CGE models, forecasting models. The initial assessment for South Africa, which we did in April last year, is one of the first economy-wide evaluations of the potential impact of COVID-19 in a developing country. Many other countries are using this type of analysis or a modified version of it to assess the impact of COVID, of the recovery, of lockdowns. So we'll focus. We've written a number of papers on this, but we'll focus on this initial assessment today. But also, I'll draw on some of the insights from some of our other work and throwbacks to some other COVID-19 related research. This essay-tied paper was a collaboration between researchers from the National Treasury, the South African Reserve Bank, UNU WIDER, IFPRI, and SOAS, to gauge the potential impacts and transmission of the pandemic and lockdown on the real economy in South Africa. So when the research started in mid-March, we knew little about how the pandemic and lockdown would unfold in South Africa. And at the time, there were very few other modeling efforts taking place to model the impact. But something we knew is that, without vaccines or pharmaceutical interventions, physical distancing would be the main tool to limit spread. But breaking social and economic contacts would impose very negative shocks on the economy, and these wouldn't be borne equally across society. So what we did was to try and get some first pass estimates of the impact of the initial lockdown. And most modeling taking place at the time was at a highly aggregated macro level, but we took a bottom-up modeling approach, as Rob's just explained. So we're using a SAM multiplier model, which is appropriate. The suddenness of the pandemic and the lockdown means that intertemporal relationships, price responses, and other effects, which are typically embedded inside econometric models or CGE models, these things drive the decisions and behavior of those kinds of models. These might not work given the intensity, suddenness, and temporary nature of lockdowns. So we considered there to be four main ways in which the pandemic and lockdown were affecting the economy. First was the closing non-essential industries and the movement restrictions, which effectively put many parts of the economy in suspended animation. We had to think on the impact on what this would mean for the demand and supply of different commodities. And we used the published regulations to determine which sectors and commodities might be affected. So as Rob's mentioned, the SAM for South Africa covers 104 commodities across 62 different types of industries. And in each of those, we needed to make an assessment based on what we were seeing in those published regulations on what could happen to different commodities. In addition to these supply side effects, we also needed to match what was happening at the macro level. So, for example, the uncertainty caused by the pandemic meant there would be a decline in investment projects and activity for a while. And based on these, we had to take a look at capital goods and reduce investment demand at varying degrees of between 60 to 80%. In addition to our own self-imposed restrictions, what you also saw was a decline in export demand because globally trade was slowing down. So for this, we also needed to take a view on what would happen to export demand, which we assessed to fall between 40 and 75%. So let's go to some key findings from this. I'm not sure if you see my cursor here, but I'll try and go to them from right and in clockwise direction. What we saw was what we estimated was a substantial loss of GDP. We estimated GDP to fall by 34% during the lockdown period, compared with a no COVID, no lockdown situation. So one of the ways in which we can assess this is taking a look at what happened in that month. So we had a level 5 lockdown for 5 weeks between the end of March and the end of April 2020, and I'll show you some of those comparisons a little bit later. But given the sizes of these shocks, we estimated that GDP could fall by around 34% in that month. At the sectoral level, if you take a look at how varied the different projections are by sector, we see deep but also varied cuts in value added. We can see the construction, trade, and the informal sector are hit hard. Some of these sectors aren't especially large compared to others in the economy, but for example, construction is very important for employment. Trade, retail and wholesale trade, and the informal sector are very important sources of income for vulnerable groups. So that the lockdowns are disproportionately hitting them hard is an important takeaway from this analysis. Another thing that's quite important is that sectors that weren't, at least it wasn't published that they would be, or sectors that were considered essential and were allowed to continue opening couldn't escape the effect of the pandemic. Sectors that weren't shut down inevitably suffered from low demand. If you take a look at the utilities section, the utilities sector over here, the electricity sector was allowed to continue. It's an essential service. However, because other sectors in the economy were forced to shut down, the impact of lower demand for electricity inevitably reduced value added in the electricity sector. One of the things that we were asked to do is to try and compare what we saw in our analysis to what had actually unfolded. Now, something that Rob mentioned is that multiplier models aren't really forecasting tools in themselves, but given the severity and given that the pandemic was the dominant event that had taken place at the time, they may be useful in informing what could happen to economic performance. For example, at the time, other events such as the sovereign rating downgrade by Moody's in March 2020 will have influenced things like the exchange rate and risk premia. However, this was completely overshadowed by what had happened in April. So we can take a look at some of these comparisons. If you take a look at the table on the right, you can see the production estimates from Stats for the month in question, April 2020. These are taken from the latest data available for them. And on the right, you can see what had been indicated from our research. And although they're very close, even though there's, for example, a 9 percentage point difference in mining production, given the scale of this decline, what we appreciated about this comparison is that the model was telling us, at least in terms of relative impact, what the potential impact could have been, or what the potential impact was, and that the insights that we were getting from the analysis were indeed valid. Going into some of the details that are embedded in the SAM that we could see from the analysis is that the sharp, unexpected loss of income brings high risks of food insecurity. From an income level, workers with lower levels of education were hardest hit, and most of these workers are in the bottom half of the income distribution. Indeed, for people who live in those households, transfers from governments are an important source of income. So that government grants could continue and were indeed expanded, helped to blunt but not offset this income shock. To be clear, the scenarios that we modeled didn't include the changes in transfers that had existed in the system. So the introduction of TERS and the Social Relief of Distress Fund and the expansion of existing grants. But it's important to remember that the grant system, although not designed to deal with the pandemic, was infrastructure that was in place for government to be able to offer some resilience to vulnerable households. An important reason to take a look at this is that poor households are especially sensitive to pandemic and economic risks. 30 to 50% of spending in the bottom 50% of households is on food. Research by Shifa, David, and Leibrand showed that the poorest quintile was the least ready for lockdown and the most vulnerable to infection. Now, the outlook for the pandemic and the economic response, both in South Africa and around the world, was extremely uncertain. At the time, projections of what could happen to macroeconomic variables were all over the place. So it was important to try and get a sense of what was the range of possibilities that could exist, for macroeconomic variables. There was very little data at the start of 2020 to give a signal of how the year could unfold, but also on very little on what the pandemic's impact would be. So what we needed to do was take a range of different scenarios with a bunch of explicit and implicit assumptions about how the economy works, about how lockdowns would unfold, to try and get a range of different outcomes to help inform how different institutions were forecasting for the year, but also to try and get a sense of where would the most sensitive parts of demand, of production would be. Sorry, and I've added a little column in there just to show where the actual outcomes were for 2020 in relation to some of the scenarios that we had run. So we see that what had actually transpired was something between our quick and slow recovery scenarios. But what's happened over the course of the remainder of the year? Well, because restrictions were loosened, the economy kind of just went back into production. So we call this an autonomous recovery, and it's what contributed to a lot of the improvement after the second quarter of the year. But we also think that income support at the lower end of the income distribution does have a story to tell here. It provided some stimulus and prevented a worse outcome than could have occurred. However, many workers, households, and firms have been left behind because there are still restrictions on contact-intensive activity and low demand. So if you take a look at the chart, GDP fell more than employment, but it has recovered. But there's still a very large gap that exists between what the economy can produce now and what it could in 2019. We're still at around 3.2% below the 2019 average. Which is, in ordinary times, still a very shocking gap. We're seeing that the response to employment is not as strong as it is in GDP, and this is an important issue for growth, not only in the short term, but if the effects of the pandemic don't unwind and we risk getting stuck into a permanent status of making it very difficult to create jobs with growth. Many sectors have recovered to close to 2019 levels, although some industries are very, very weak. And although consumption and exports have bounced back, the consumption numbers hide very detailed what's happening at a household level. And at the same time, investment is still very weak, which alongside poor employment numbers can reduce South Africa's growth potential in the future. So some key takeaways from what Rob and I have been discussing this morning. First is that the usefulness of a model really depends on what it can analyze. A one-size-fits-all approach is quite limited, and policymakers need a suite of tools. SAM multiplier models have strong assumptions, but those made sense for analyzing COVID-19. Indirect effects and industrial and household detail matter. This enables us to analyze the distribution of impacts and captures important feedback mechanisms, transmission mechanisms, and helps unpack the broader story of what's going on and helps policymakers avoid unintended consequences. Scenario analysis can be useful in assessing and planning for risk and informing policy responses. So one thing that the pandemic has certainly showed us is that it's important to at least to project and plan for low probability, high impact events, such as health, potential dangers to the health system, climate risks, for example, and it's certainly highlighting that we need to have these in place. The impact of COVID-19 has been large, but recovery has been fast, but imbalanced and incomplete. The autonomous recovery and stimulatory effect of government grants did help, but the pandemic is not over. The longer the drag on economic growth, the higher the risk of permanent damage. There has been some scope for temporary government support to help provide emergency relief to vulnerable groups, but we should not forget to focus on addressing structural growth constraints for stronger, fairer growth and jobs. The recent growth is welcome, but we do run the risk of hitting pre-pandemic speed limits. The policy agenda already emphasizes boosting competitiveness, network industries and infrastructure, and the pandemic has placed a spotlight on building resilience and policy space to support vulnerable groups. And with that, I know we've gone way over time. I'll yield back to the chair. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sherwin and Professor Rob, for those very insightful inputs, I guess. And I can really see in the comment section in our discussion here that many people are quite appreciative of not only just the theoretical foundations that you've also given us, but also how you've been able to apply those to what we faced with COVID-19. And one comment there from Urvashi saying, super interesting content. It actually made me understand the models more. And I think many people are also asking for the possibility of the slides. Cassandra also saying, yeah, you've taken a very complex topic and you've simplified it in a way that makes a lot of us really understand some of these issues. Maybe Sherwin, just a brief question, because we do have a bit of time, and we'll take a few more questions from the colleagues. To the last point that you were making towards the tail end there around some of the, I guess, questions around our potential growth and, you know, some of the structural features of that, and whether or not we might hit up against, I guess, a long-term growth constraint that we faced even prior to COVID-19. When you look at a model like this, I guess people often ask, you know, what then is the implication in terms of how people act, and from a policy perspective, what are some of the trade-offs and choices? And I think, Professor Rob, you can also maybe comment on that. From what we've seen and where the impact has been very severe, what are some of the maybe 2 or 3 actions that are going to be critical to not just only recover from this, but also recover on a basis where our long-term growth potential is potentially a lot better than what we had before?
All right, Rob, I'm not sure if you'd like to go ahead.
You go first, sure.
All right, no problem. Yes, indeed. What the pandemic has certainly done is, you know, it slowed down the progress of very important reforms that we need to help boost the ability of people to, you know, create jobs, start their own businesses, and have the economy on a stronger footing than it has been over the past several years. But at the same time, it does show that we need to have the right buffers in place to be able to respond to these kinds of risks when they happen. I'm not saying that, you know, we're going to have a pandemic every 5 years. However, recent events over the past decade, for example, you know, multi-year droughts in the middle of the preceding decade, COVID-19, upcoming anticipated declines in agricultural yield, for example, due to climate change, are things that, you know, we need to plan and prepare for, and also recognize, you know, these risks. Policy departments such as the Treasury, you know, would value things like this. So, for example, if you have a climate outcome that would reduce the lifespan of a road, for example, they need to take these into account inside their planning. So, you know, from a policy perspective, this kind of modeling is quite important. on the topic of, what are the things that we can do to improve, the potential growth in South Africa. Well, that's not been helped by the fact that investment has been quite weak because of the uncertainty related to the pandemic, but certainly improving the availability, the quantity and productivity of capital in South Africa, as well as the skills to be able to operate that capital in a competitive way, are very important levers in increasing our potential growth, and certainly undo the decline of weaker potential growth that we've seen over the past decade. Rob, I'll hand over to you. You've got more insights.
Yeah, if I can, first of all, what should South Africa do? I am a Zimbabwean economist, and I hesitate to offer advice from Zimbabwe to South Africa as to what to do. But let me focus just on the modeling aspect thing. Can these models say something about what should be done, what can be done? They're very limited in that sense. It's very hard to have models going forward when there's behavioral change involved, because we've calibrated the model on the past in a way, and in a way we have to do that. The one thing the models can do, and I think these types of models are really good at, is if you make some guess about what you think should happen in the future, because of this nature that the SAM has to balance. I can't change one number in the SAM. We're going to invest more. Okay, where's that investment coming from? Because things aren't going to balance. We've got to have more savings. Where's the savings coming from? Well, we better reduce consumption or whatever. So forcing yourself, we may still be guessing, but we're making consistent guesses, and we're constraining our guesses. And I think a lot of the stuff that we need to do about thinking about the future, we need imaginative thinking. What happens if we can change people's behavior in certain regards? Let's put the outcomes into the model and see how are we going to rebalance, and what kinds of things are going to come from it. I know, for example, many politicians have wonderful schemes about infrastructure investment and so on. The World Cup was going to provide a real boost to South Africa's growth. In terms of these models, when you start asking that, where's the cement for building the stadia for the World Cup coming from? Well, it's coming from investment that might have gone into housing or other things. So it's not so much as an add-on, additional impact on the economy. It's a shifting around. And I think thinking in this economy-wide framework and constraining yourself to guessing, constraining. I shouldn't use the word guessing. It's constraining our intelligent reflections on what might happen, or otherwise guesses. It's a good way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that response.
I say I don't want to give South Africa advice, but I will say, as a Southern African, the thing that strikes me in South Africa, everyone's aware of it. It's right, number one on the agenda. Very little gets done about it. To me, the biggest existential threat for South Africa is inequality, and we don't really see action on the ground. We see a lot of talk about it, but we don't see action on the ground. And I think that's where the South African big thinkers need to get practical things, not listing our woes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think you're right, Prof. I mean, because that in many ways influences some of the future-looking behavioral issues that you are raising, exactly. And without a shadow of a doubt, also distributionally as well. I think Sean was showing us there that some of the sectors that were hardest hit by a shock like COVID-19 happen to be the sectors, low wage, low productivity, requiring a lot of physical contact. And in many ways, that then deepens this challenge of inequality that we face. Yeah. Exactly. Professor Rob Davies, you mustn't be afraid, I guess, to comment on the South African economy. You've done such considerable amount of work in that space, so I think you must feel free. And I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I think it's certainly been very valuable for the students. And Sherwin, Gabriel as well, thank you very much for your time. So we're nearing 9:30, and I understand we have to shuffle and move between the different rooms here. But yeah, Professor Rob and Sherwin have really warmed us up nicely. And our next discussions will be honing in on a few, I guess, real economy implications of COVID-19 that we've seen. We're going to take a look at tourism. We're going to look at the agricultural sector, and we'll take a bit of a deep dive into the agricultural sector, looking at the wine industry, one of the major export sectors in the agricultural sector in our economy. And yeah, that should certainly be a fascinating conversation. We'll have Dr. Unati Enama, Dr. Tracy Davids, and Mr. Wandile Sihlobo, who are going to be joining us for that particular chat. But don't forget, we've got the poll running. So certainly do fill out that poll, rate your overall experience of these sessions and of the content that's been covered, and of some of the speakers as well. And also we have a survey that we're running throughout the course of the day, so you can check that out in the reception area. So let's take a brief, I guess, hiatus, and when we come back, we'll go straight into our session, taking a look at the real economy. Professor Rob and Sherwin, thank you once again.
Thank you, Abang, and thank you, everyone.